Close your eyes and march in place. So go ahead and close your eyes and march in place for a second. Hop up and down. And then as you kind of close your eyes and come back to whatever your normal is, you'll get a kind of a different sense for how your feet will be moving when you're walking or running or whatever else you're doing when you're not thinking about it, which is going to be a very large percentage of time. And then now you can go ahead and make that correction. So the first thing we do is I like to widen my feet first to the appropriate width, the pelvis width. And then I like to find those lateral points to straighten my feet, keeping in mind that the most simplified way that you probably read about foot position is lining up the outside edge of the foot. But that's not actually what we do, right? Not?
Right.
You're lining up 2 points on the foot, because if you look at the outside edge of the foot, it's not straight, and it's not straight ranges through the person. So just below the pinky toe, that first kind of bony protrusion, that's 1 point, and then if you drop a plumb line from the lateral malleoli, that's your 2nd point. So as you look down, it could look like the back of the foot steers inward a little bit, and the midpoint of the foot could kind of steer outward. So usually the first thing people will say when you straighten them out is, this feels pigeon-toed, right? So if you look down at the toes, sometimes if you've been walking with your feet out for a long time, because of the rotational mechanics of how we work, you end up accelerating the toes kind of around the bend. So they're still pointing forward because they're not attached in a fixed way to the foot. They're connected, but they're not fastened to the foot in a way that doesn't allow them to rotate on their own. So when people say this feels pigeon-toed, I don't know, I've never really seen a pigeon that looked, quote, pigeon-toed, but their toes could be steering inward. So you're like, yeah, absolutely, your toes definitely look like they're doing what pigeons' toes do, which is point in, I guess. But what we're going to do is we're going to not really pay attention to the toes. We're going to kind of come on down and cut the toes off with your hand. And if you look at the rectangle, the approximate rectangle of the foot, you'll see that the foot is tracking straight ahead. So we use those lateral points because they're the points that deviate the left. They deviate the least amount because they're very rigid and connected. So they're a good indication of the hinge of the ankle joint, which is then a good indication of where the muscles that do plantar flexion are operating. And then above that, they're the platform for ensuring that the muscles that extend the hip are also in the plane that we want, that sagittal plane, so that we're always propelling forward and not slightly off to the right and slightly off to the left with each step. So if those toes are curved in, perhaps the first thing someone should learn how to do is put their toes back out, away from the pigeon point, which is obviously towards the midline, and kind of spread them out and away from each other. So without moving the foot, see if you can lift your pinky toes and then all the other subsequent toes and pull them out and away from each other, so that maybe they would be straightening their toes out of pigeon land until they point straight ahead. So just that itself, that toe abduction, is an exercise in itself. And if when you really do it, you will feel a lot of work kind of coming up through the foot. And of course, it's also a good place for you to check and make sure your pelvis is not forward and riding on the front of the foot, but is instead back, allowing the toes to move without being kind of loaded by the entire weight of your body. Feel pretty good? Now as you spread your toes, you want to notice if when you spread, do they also lift? Can you refine your spread command to just be spread and not have an element of extension or lift of the toes? And as you're watching, if you have a mirror, as you're looking ahead, when you spread your toes, do your ankles collapse inward towards each other? Can you maintain that ankle position as you spread the toes. It might reduce the distance that you spread your toes, but you're stabilizing the ankle here. And then, believe it or not, because this might make you tired, you can go ahead and stretch the top of your foot. So I'm going to turn this way so that the camera can pick up what I'm doing. This nice top of the foot stretch. I love this stretch. I know that a lot of people hate it, but I like it.
I get it myself when I do it.
Do you?
It's kind of nice. Yeah, it feels good.
Ooh. And you can go and try the other side. Top of the foot stretch. Can you lift and wiggle those toes on the front foot? That's another way to check and see if your pelvis is migrated forward, if your pelvis or your hips are still back, kind of over that back foot. All right, and you can go ahead and come off from that. Let's go back to finding that same stance position. Now let's say you teach foot position, and as soon as you do, as soon as the feet come in, it's like, oh, my knee, I can feel the strain in my knees here from turning my feet in, is another very common point of feedback that we get. So even though external rotation is in a more advanced kind of exercise, if straightening the foot causes so much distortion of the knee, if say someone's lower leg is really rotated outward, the shank is externally rotated, then you want to give them something that decreases the discomfort in the knee. So if you put your hands on the front of the thigh, that's where we use external rotation to place the knee back where it goes, so that you haven't corrected the foot but then left the knees, banging into each other when someone takes a step. So that external rotation, which you can see more detailed on the All About Your Knees video, is a rotation at the hip that comes ideally from the pelvic floor and not from the quadriceps. So when you rotate your thighs open, you should still be able to lift and lower your kneecaps. So at that point, you might have to teach someone to lift and lower their kneecaps, which they probably got into 1A, hopefully. And it maybe only took 3 or 4 months to secure a kneecap release. But once you've externally rotated, you can see how that affects the hinge joint of the ankle, right? So as you're watching it in the mirror, if you are, when people are extremely flat-footed, which they'll, call themselves flat-footed, you can note that by externally rotating, it is part of what creates that arch shape underneath the foot. There's what moves the foot relative to the foot, that mobility that you have to have an arch, but you also have to have lateral hip strength in order to have an arch, which means your femurs have to be in their neutral position. So just a little bit of turn, and as you turn all the way, which normally you would evaluate from behind, you might find that the balls of the feet are up in the air a little bit. So let that happen. You don't want to try to keep the ball of the foot down as you teach external rotation, because then you have a lot of torque on the knee. Better to let the knee not be encumbered by the foot for this exercise. So the ball of the foot is up in the air, maybe. The thighs are in neutral. And if you want to reach back and feel your knee pits to see if you need to correct one more than the other, because you can't tell the quantity that you need to externally rotate from the front. You can only tell it from the back. So as you're hanging out there and you found where you're supposed to go, evaluate the distance the balls of your feet are from the floor. And this gives you an indication of 2 things. One, how much range of motion in the forefoot, the front of the foot, still needs to be restored so that the ball of the foot can reach the floor, or how much the shank needs to rotate medially to help that come down. Because sometimes the height of your ball of your foot could be coming from the rotation of the shank, not just from the structural limitation of the foot. All right, so you don't really know